Now, Havana is talking of an attempted armed infiltration in connection, with acts of terrorism. What else do we know at this moment about the profiles of these alleged attackers?
Well, all we know is the official statements from the Ministry of the Interior, which say that these people are Cubans who live in the United States, and we don't know more than what they've told us. Apparently, the Ministry of the Interior says that a lot of them have criminal records, and that actually they named two of them who have Cuban arrest warrants for terrorist activities. So these seem to be known people, at least some of them, from the Cuban side. We don't know that much. It's interesting that the US is suspending judgment until they know more information. And what's interesting about this is really the coastguards between the two countries have been collaborating, unbroken collaboration between the two countries. They do collaborate in this area, which is, maybe a surprise to people, given that the United States decision to block oil imports into Cuba was made on the basis of Cuba being a security threat to the United States. But actually, Cuba sees the United States as a security threat against Cuba. But nonetheless, both countries do actually collaborate on security issues. So, this in a way, this kind of exposes, the complexity, really, of the relationship between the two countries.
And in that light, an embarrassment for authorities in Havana, but also potentially then for Washington.
Well, indeed. It's obviously something which needs to be looked into. It's caused alarm in the United States and so on. And everybody comes to their own conclusions. But until we know the full facts, I wouldn't like to say what's happened, except that, the Coast Guard, the Cuban Coast Guard and the US Coast Guard are both professional organizations, and they don't make up stories. At least there's no evidence of them doing that. So, there's an interesting story here.
Now, this does, of course, come at a difficult time for the Cuban government. You mentioned it yourself, crippling oil blockade that's wreaking havoc on the Cuban economy. Should we then understand this incident in the wider context of frustrations with the Cuban authorities, or is that a little bit too soon?
I think what we could possibly link it to is the expectation among people who want to bring down the Cuban government in Miami is that their own narrative is always that Cuba's on the verge of collapse. And so they think that if they just went over there and helped to bring down the government, that might precipitate the collapse. I've just came back from Cuba last week. There's no sign of collapse. There is a lot of sign of economic difficulties, certainly, and particularly transport difficulties, which have profound effects on the ability of the health service, for example, to make sure that people get the treatment that they need. And that's the focus, in a way, of the Cuban government's rationing of whatever oil, petrol, diesel is available to keep transport available to the hospitals. But, inevitably, people will suffer and people will die because they don't get the medical assistance that they need as a result of this difficulty.
And you mentioned earlier, of course, the heightened tensions between Havana and Washington. We've heard from the US a lot of, how can I put this? They're keen to highlight that they're going to carry out their own investigations. They're not taking Havana's word for it as far as the details of this latest incident. Are you expecting what we've seen to further exacerbate tensions between the US and Cuba?
I don't really think so. I think, this is a specific event. It's definitely not a US government-sponsored raid. And so this is, some hotheads in Miami who've done what they do. So I don't think it particularly will affect their relationship. I think what's going on, as far as I can see, is the US has imposed these blocking the oil imports, expecting it to precipitate a huge crisis. That hasn't happened. Cuba actually generates half of its electricity from its own supplies of oil, gas, and solar power. So it can limp along. I mean, it's not the complete collapse of everything, but it's causing an awful lot of hardship. And so the longer this goes on, I suppose, in a sense, the more frustrating it is for the United States because they haven't achieved their objectives of forcing the Cuban government to the negotiating table on their terms. And so, as time goes on, I think there is scope for discussions, but the objectives, I suppose, of what the US is trying to do have not been met. So, it's causing an awful lot of difficulty, and it's certainly impairing Cuba's economic development, economic growth, standard of living, creating enormous hardship. I think, what it's hard for us to imagine is how difficult it is for, Cubans all over the island to do their everyday things. They just can't get the transport to get to where they need to get. And that is a big problem. And it means that agricultural production will be reduced and so on. So, but in terms of the relationship between the US and Cuba, unless there's something that's discovered which we don't know, I think in a way possibly contributes towards the US having to admit that the policy that they've been pursuing is not achieving the objectives, partly because it was based on false premises about the degree of dependency of Cuba's energy system on imported oil.
Emily Morris, thank you very much. Emily Morris, Honorary Senior Research Associate at University College London's Institute of the Americas there.